They're ready to talk about They're going to talk about the news partnership experience from a tech perspective and, offer hopefully some kind of clarity for many journalists and publishers as they think about future partnership with technology. So I'm your host, Paul Chun. I'm the strategic advisor for Hacks and Hackers, focusing on imagining the health of the information ecosystem, especially in context of AI. Our speakers include Benjamin Wagner. He's currently a consultant, creative, and founder of Essential Industry, a consulting firm specializing in individual and organization strategy. Um, he have spent half a decade helping launch Facebook's journalism project globally to his tenure and transforming MTV News and also the award-winning PBS documentary, Mr. Roger and Me. We also have Madhav Chinnappa. He's the senior executive consultant who has worked at the intersection of news, technology, AI, and sustainability globally for more than 2 decades. He formally launched the DNI Fund, the GNI Innovation Challenge Program, and also the Journalism Emergency Relief Fund while he was at Google. And right now, he's currently the VP of Partnership for Human Native AI, as well as a leading thought leadership event series around AI news for Thomson Foundation in the UK. And finally, we have Naketa Patel. Currently, she's the Senior Director of Leadership Programs at the Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism at CUNY in New York. Previously, she was a Senior Director of Partnership at the 19th. And prior to that, she was the partnership in the US for Twitter, where she collaborated with many of us on strategic initiative and product adoption. First of all, thank you for participating. Second, I just want to be really clear. While I was a journalist at AP and all these organizations, I really do enjoy working with all of you and your colleagues in the partnership team in particular. But today's conversation is less about the individual, but it's really about the intent of the tech company and the partnership with tech. So maybe Ben, Manav, and Nikita, you could first talk about your role at the partnership teams and tell us sort of like, some of the key insights there. So
I'll give
Ben,
you
go first.
I'll give you a little context on how I got in the door, and then we can go a little deeper, but we can kind of go around the horn there if you like. I started in 2014. I was hired as a managing editor, as you may recall, Paul. So I was tasked with leading editorial curation across products like paper, long since deprecated, trending, and sort of less visible surfaces like sports and events. And then in 2016, I pivoted to global news programs and helped launch the Facebook Journalism Project with guys like Andy Mitchell and Jason White, and eventually Campbell Brown and hundreds of other folks. So that my primary scope was investment in and sort of engagement with organizations like ONA and CPT and EJC, and then our own sort of what I often called owned and operated programs. We did sort of first to market scale programs, convening hundreds of people and talking about products and learning new skills. And then this is for Madhav. I was tasked at one point with launching, quote, our Newsgeist, which became our executive news summits, which we did for about a year and a half just prior to COVID, sort of stopping global travel in its tracks.
Okay, that's a nice toss to Manav.
There you go.
Thank you. That's very funny. Yeah, imitation is the sincerest form of flattery.
There's a lot of that.
Yeah. So I joined Google in 2010, and I was the second news partnerships person for Google ever, and there was one guy in New York. And to give you a sense of scale, they had no idea where to put the news guy, so I was with the books team, right? And then ended up news became, started to get hotter, and I ended up building like two news partnerships teams, as was mentioned, product partnerships team, and then a strategic relations team. I helped create DNI, the Digital News Initiative, which was based around product training and research, and had an innovation fund, which it's most famous for. And I think we would say, I think Ben, you would say it was the inspiration for the Facebook Journalism Project. I think
if we were being honest, that would be a nice way to put it. Yeah.
Yeah. And then that was for EMEA. And so then in typical tech style, they were like, let's make this for the globe, and that became GNI, and I was running the kind of ecosystems and innovation side of that until I got laid off last summer, which my small version of that is process sucked, outcome great. So. And
Nikita?
before that, just for context, I used to work at the BBC, and before that, I was at AP. So I've always considered myself a news guy. And actually, I think I got into Google because when I was at the BBC, I used to complain to them about what they did in news and said, "You don't get news, and whenever you do it with the New York Times and Washington Post. So you should do more." So that's me.
Thank you. Nikita?
All right. Well, thank you all for having me today. I've been the biggest Hacks Hackers fan since its inception. So it really is an honor to be part of this event today. So I'm Nikita, as mentioned, and in addition to running leadership programs at CUNY, I'm also VP of the Board of Directors for ONA. And I have basically been in journalism for 2 decades. And so I've worked in many, many newsrooms in digital the whole time, launched, 1,000 newsletters and podcasts. And as these products have come in vogue and gone out of vogue and come back again, right? As we've seen so much happen within digital journalism. And yeah, so from a platform perspective, I worked in many newsrooms and managed these platform partnerships. And then, of course, worked at Rebel Mouse, and then remember Rebel Mouse? And then I worked at Twitter for 6 years. And so I was at Twitter from 2015 to 2021, all the way from, the Trump administration into insurrection time, and worked on many, many initiatives. So I oversaw US news partnerships from a print and digital perspective and focused on all kinds of key events, right? So going on the campaign trail and working, on debates, and then obviously different election night events and things. And then remember, Vine and Periscope, working on launching partnerships around those products. And then, of course, we integrated live into the main platform finally, as we went from 140 characters to 280. This feels like a history lesson, but we've all lived through this, right? And then with Twitter finally integrating things like GIFs and stickers and all kinds of things, our own version of stories, not so great. I've seen many products come and go, and worked on many, many partnerships in that time, and then also worked on monetization as well. And so yeah, I feel like my time at Twitter it was an incredible moment of time. There was just like, when I joined the company, the narrative was it was sliding down a cliff and then not driving traffic. And so, we constantly had to, fight for what our value proposition was as a platform and as a partner for the news industry. And, I left in the summer of 21 after we had launched Twitter Spaces, and that product was amazing because of the product adoption, but it was so buggy, and it was very interesting to work on that. But when I left, it felt like a little bit of a divorce, quite frankly, because that job took so much of my energy and passion and time. So in addition to working on strategic initiatives, I also oversaw verification. The blue check mark was the bane of my existence. And every single weekend, different journalists were under attack. And, these hacking groups around the world knew they could target newsrooms and journalists, right, in terms of hacks and abuse off hours, and that would like put the rest of us into a tailspin. So that was my life for 6 entire years. And
Yeah.
I
So,
also personally went through a divorce in 2020. And so it felt like I had that going on personally, and then leaving Twitter felt like another whole emotional sort of like divorce. So anyway, I'll stop there,
talking
but get into
about
the event.
divorce, I feel like it's a very good metaphor. I felt like the news industry with technology companies, particularly the big three, I feel like, you know, we were courted, by the tech companies, promise product, promise reach, promise traffic, who everyone remember the pivot to video, like a lot of sort of like promises to get us to in this marriage. But I feel like fast forward to today, like, you know, our marriage with Twitter ended in divorce, and we really didn't walk away with any, kind of settlement, right? Same with Facebook. We ended in divorce. Google, I feel like we are still in some kind of arrangement, but is it a loving marriage? I don't know, right? is a marriage of some sort. So my question for you guys is like, now in hindsight, again, not about the partnership team, like, do you think the publisher actually gain anything from partnering with these companies? Like, what were some of the tangible gains that you think was really important? And and vice versa, like why did Facebook, Google, and Twitter pursue partnership with news company? Is it just to get us off our back, or did they truly believe like in the mission of journalism? Again, not you guys individually, but from the company standpoint.
Can I take a run at this?
Yeah.
Because I think maybe being the oldest guy on the call, and by the way, I see a lot of friends on the call as well, so hello. I think it's interesting, at least my experience of the journey, right? So in when I was hired in 2010, it was the kind of go-go years of Google. It was in what I call the era of of traffic, right? And so I think at that time, maybe slightly naively, I was hired to just try to help, right? And because they were trying to do good things and they were just trying to help. And there was, people didn't have the bandwidth, and the reality was that it was Google's partnerships team was essentially designed around revenue. So, if you were bringing revenue either from ads or from ad tech, you got service. But if you weren't a big revenue source, then you didn't get a lot of attention, right? So that's why they started with one person. But I think what happened in that journey, once they started out with let's see if we can hire somebody to help, is that then, at least in Europe, what happened is that the pressure started to heat up when around the European Copyright Directive, right? And what happened then was there was a bunch of us who the response to this was, hey, listen, they're asking for this link tax because digital has fundamentally disrupted their business model. So why don't we go and help with that so that they don't need to have, regulation? I mean, the naivety of that in looking back is hilarious, right? And people can say, "Oh, was it this? Was it that?" But I was there, and that was genuinely our intention. And so that's how we built DNI, because we actually went and talked to a bunch of publishers and said, what can we work on? And that's how we developed the pillars of product, training, and research, and the Innovation Fund. And so I think in terms of the tangible thing, I do think there were some tangible products, right? Not all of which got deprecated, or at least still surviving, like AMP, which at the time, and AMP gets very misunderstood, but like at the time, Facebook was pitching instant articles, which was all like, give us your content and we'll host it. And we were trying to come up with a more open version, which is why it was an open source, because, there was a worry about what was going to happen to the open web, right, at that time. And I do think that was a positive thing for the industry in terms of the open web of that. Then we also did like the training and the research, and we were a big funder. I need to stop saying we. Sorry, Google was a funder of the the digital news report, which took when we were damn it, when Google funded it first, it was great, but it was actually very limited. And it's now in over 40 countries, which I think is a good thing. And then there was the Innovation Fund, and personally, yeah, I did a little calculation that like me and my teams and the teams I worked on, we put close to $250 million of Google's money into the industry. But the thing that I don't know about that piece is what impact it had. And that's one that is always kind of like, I wish I did better in terms of tracking, but that's my take. Sorry, I'm sure others have things to say.
Yeah, I want to circle back to impact afterward, because I sometimes wonder, is this an issue just with news media in general and less about technology company, but it's really hard for news to think about like quantifiable impact, right? That is like very different than how tech companies think about impact. So Ben, about you in terms of like, what did people got away with? What did people gain from working with Facebook?
I mean, it's really nice to hear these other perspectives. My sense is, like, I don't know, sometimes I think and this won't surprise you knowing me a little bit, Paul, maybe Nikita and Madhav as well. Like, it's possible that my glasses were a little rose-colored in 2014. But my sense was, there was concern that Twitter was gobbling up all the news usership, and that was an opportunity to basically as a growth hack, right? And that there was all this data that supported that audiences were consuming news on the platform, whether we had these relationships or not. So that's kind of the Andy Mitchell era. And then there's this crisis, like post-trending, post-election, 2016, where there's suddenly tons of heat about what kind of malfeasances were occurring with outside parties interfering with content, with allegations unfounded around what was happening curatorially. And I think there's sort of different eras, but certainly that second era was marked more by, let's call it, comms and press opportunities. But I didn't work with an individual, to your point, and organizations or collections of individuals who weren't journalists and weren't committed to protecting democracy and being sure that the best content is what people are finding, ever. But I did hear north of me conversations about good press and good comms. So, which I think at the end of the day, with regulation, was the bottom line. But it was a growth hack, right? Like, audiences are doing this. We need to create stickier services. This is where they're at. And then, you have this era of the rise of the creator. And now you have Mosseri saying, with Threads, I don't know, was it last year? Well, we don't want news, right? Because you don't need news, because you have individuals who are serving the same content production. I don't have metrics on this. Maybe one of y'all does. But, we have individuals creating so much content that I suspect you don't need the volume of publishers. So it's kind of three eras in this growth arc in there somehow. That makes sense, that track?
Yeah, I feel like we're like the tech platforms like first wives, right? Like we help grow with our content, and now they found some shinier, newer, more agile.
Polygamy, many, many, many wives or husbands. Yeah.
I was to say, or husbands. Hello.
Yep.
Partners. Yes. Nikita, what about Twitter? Like,
Sure. Yeah. So from a Twitter perspective, Twitter and news went hand in hand from like the inception of the platform too, right? Like think about like the Hudson Landing, think about all these things like journalists, creators, citizen journalists flock to the platform, right? And so that was a huge opportunity for the company. And given Twitter's stance on freedom of speech, freedom of expression, the First Amendment, it was just such a natural thing to want to cultivate partnerships, right, with publishers and journalists and newsrooms around the world. And so that's ultimately why I joined the company and took on the role, because folks who had been there in previous iterations, right? Chloe Sladden, folks are very familiar with Chloe's work. Andrew Fitzgerald, he's one of the reasons I went to work at Twitter. He created the curation team, right? They before Elon ruthlessly fired them all, there were about 100 people working on various curation projects around the world at that point. And so yeah, and that's another reason why they did that, right? They deeply cared in the mission of journalism, advocating for journalists in terms of safety. When I joined Twitter, we didn't have a misinformation policy. It was such a gray area, and I had to work behind the scenes with our policy team and comms team and others to establish one, and then work on partnerships with regards to that, right? Ben mentioned there was so much of that, right, flaring up in the era of when I was at Twitter as well. So yeah, it really behooved us to have strategic partnerships with publishers that were mutually beneficial in the interest, not only in publishers' interest with regards to like monetization. I didn't have a big checkbook like my friends over here. And so I brought goodwill with me, well-intentioned people that wanted newsrooms and journalists to make money, quite frankly, and to help with sustainability of the industry. So that was kind of our POV.
yeah, I mean, now that you guys are sort of like a bit away from your former job, right? Like again, not so much about the news partner team. Do you guys felt, not the team itself, but from the company, like were they genuine? I mean, because like almost every conversation, like I remember like with any one of you is always like, not you, but like the company's just like, we're here to help. I'm just like, but what do you think we got in the news industry? Like, what did we actually got like after a decade of partnership? Like, I don't know, because like really between the three of you, you guys almost like pump in close to $1 billion
Mm-hmm.
of investment in news, right? So when you think about like what Press 4 is doing is like 500 million, that's nothing compared to what like the three of you had invested in that same period of time. But I don't know, what is it like, do you think the news publisher gotten smarter in dealing with tech platforms, or are we still sort of like at that mercy?
I think we're still in a dating phase, quite frankly, right? Like, the relationship between publishers and platforms was always a tap dance, in my opinion. And I often used to have to say, I come in peace, aside from my other platform friends. And I think publishers have learned a ton of lessons. I'd like to think that as much as platforms like they took eyeballs away, right, from owned and operated sites, I think that certain platforms did help publishers grow audiences in different places and spaces though. And I think in terms of diverse communities that, like, think of Black Twitter, right? Like think of all these different communities and all these different movements as we think of social injustice and even like Stop Asian Hate and whatnot. At least platforms were raising awareness and trying to bridge gaps, and open things up. Even though in some instances platforms were gobbling up eyeballs and revenue, I still like to think that there's some correlation between newsrooms growing their audience and hopefully still making some revenue. So that's my again, my perspective. I'd love to hear from Ben and Madhav what they think too.
I can't speak on behalf of like whether, what that relationship looks like today, right? So I'm in a slightly different position. And again, I'll acknowledge that this might be a little Pollyanna-ish, but my sense was, and what kept me at it, even when it was really challenging, and it was often really challenging, you often felt like you were on your toes and sort of under duress and under attack, was there was a real skills exchange. When I was running MTV News, it was a yeoman's task to try and drag at MTV, where it's young people who are theoretically interested in change and progress and transformation, to drag people even into SEO, forget social, forget having a dialogue with an audience, right? So just at a broadest level, I think there was this catalyzing of discussion and ideally skills around product development, which was, at least at MTV News, not native at all, right? Like there was very little investment or know-how there across the organizations. Agility, testing, iterating, prototyping, that kind of mindset. Audience first thinking, engagement, analytics, social video, like some of these things just, I feel like were really catalyzed by some of the discussions that some of these organizations were leading. And again, whether the impact's there, whether it would happen anyway, I don't know. But things like accelerators, right? Like there were whole skills that were exchanged. That was part of that value proposition between the organizations, the publishers, and the platforms, right? If some of the investments in industry, in organizations like, I don't know, Wanifra, Perusia, SourceCon, right? And the engagement there. I mean, that's not worth nothing. Is it commensurate? Probably not. But
And I think the build that I would do on that is that I think it's important to realize that each of these companies are different, right? And therefore they have different sets of incentives. And we just lump them all together, and that doesn't help anything. I really want to, and I think the other element that I would like to kind of throw out there is that we cannot have this conversation, at least from a Google and Facebook point of view, without talking about regulation, right? And how I think, in my opinion, regulation screwed up the relationship. That doesn't mean it would have been perfect if there was no regulation, right? But it definitely, at least from my experience being at Google, it changed the nature of the discussion, right? And as you were saying, I think that like any big organization is just a conglomeration of people. And there are a lot of good people there who care about the news ecosystem in all the companies we're talking about. Even still, I would probably suggest even after all the layoffs. But what the most senior folks think, I think, is colored by their experience. So, my experience of this is like, Paul, you asked, did they really care? Like I had we pitched DNI to Sundar. Okay. So I was able to look him in the eye and he cared at that point. Right. He did, and that's why, I mean, the thing that doesn't get talked about around DNI is actually there was a big restructure on the product side to bring a bunch of random product teams that were all working in news under two sets of VPs, right? That was actually one of the most impactful things. Nobody outside of Google realized that because it was, it's within the, within the org chart. But I think that what happened is we were on that journey, but then the regulation then started having this like stress impact. And then the mood flipped. And I think it became, how do we deal with this regulation? And then, which broke my heart, I think it became, what's the minimum we have to do, right? And it was because of the pressure of regulation rather than the developments and things that we were working on. I think that was the thing that was done. And again, to be clear, this is regulation that was done by very powerful news organizations, right? This is News Corp, Axel Springer using their policy to essentially extract money from tech companies, right? And if you want to transfer, money from one industry to another, do a hypothecated tax, right? But don't create these arcane mechanisms around copyright or around, antitrust to do it. There's other ways to do it. Sorry, rant over.
No, I think this is actually really interesting, right? Because, in context of like fast forward to today, like really the big debate around AI and tech and news is like regulation, right? And you can't really like, and I feel like there's no universal agreement, right? And we see how different companies taking different approach. So, Ben, is that the same thing that's happening within Facebook that sort of prompted the divorce, like between them and news, like is sort of like the regulation? And I would say like at that point, most of it is really coming from like the Europe side than it is the US, right? Because I feel like we talk about regulation, it just never really crossed the line, but the Europeans actually like was
Right.
able to cross that line.
Plus one on Madhav. Like I wasn't as close to it as these guys were. Okay, let me just own my role in the organization. I was a few clicks down, and frankly, that stuff made me uncomfortable. I liked the interpersonal stuff, as you know, and that won't surprise any of you who know me at all. I always think of it this way, and Paul, you'll love this. In Media Transformation Challenge program, we have this phrase DVP, dissatisfaction, vision, and process, right? Change is created by pain, right? Like we don't change our behavior usually. Like, I don't know, I'm making this up, but people don't quit smoking cigarettes until they can't breathe or someone diagnoses them with something terminal, right? I'm making that example up, so forgive the simile here. But you need enough pain. And I think at the end of the day, between regulation, between the pressures from some of the larger publishers that Madhav just mentioned, and from the thrash around elections around the world, misinformation, disinformation, frankly, my sense was, and the scuttlebutt I was getting is that at a certain elevation of the organization, it was always, in one day, out the other. Should we stay in news? Should we get out of news? And clearly, after I exited in 2021, so it's been 3 years for me. So the full-fledged exit, withdrawal, if you will, is in that time period. So you'd have to ask somebody who's been there. But my sense is the pain became too great and not worth the return. And that's where you get Mosseri saying, we don't think of Threads as a platform for news, right? Or a surface for news. So I think it really is an aggregate of that stuff. And it may be a little bit of a reveal, or maybe it's not a surprise at all to hear that, frankly, I think at the highest levels of Facebook, at Meta now, they were always on the bubble. It was always a discussion, like, is it worth the pain? And ultimately, it just wasn't.
Yeah. And Nikita, in some way, like Twitter was the first to exit the news compared to Facebook and Google. Were the circumstances different? Was it more about Twitter's own sort of like platform economy versus regulation or other factors?
It was all Elon, quite frankly, coming in and destroying, like as I mentioned, the curation team and different products and services. Had it not been for that, like, the partnerships team would still be in place trying to do God's work, especially with regards to not only this election, but many elections, right? Half the world is voting this year, right, in different countries. And so there still is a very strong policy team who are working with different heads of states and, different parties and things like that on that side of things. But yeah, I'd like to think that, you know, we would have seen new products and different innovations and things like that with regards to the election, and it would be business as usual, unlike now where it's very stagnant. And you know that you can still find those moments of gold on Twitter during these big breaking news events and things, right? Like the essence of Twitter is still there, right? Hordes of journalists are still tweeting away, or whatever they're calling it these days, and then many newsrooms are still active on the platform because there is still so much of a flurry of activity there. So I think we're in this really interesting moment in time where, and this is rings true for me as an addict from 2008, right, to the time I worked there and beyond. We all have this love-hate relationship with Twitter, and we still all cannot effectively quit. Those that did quit the platform after Elon came in and acquired the company have come back, and maybe people are passively using Twitter now, right? Like to still gain news and information and still be smarter in a way. But I myself am not actively tweeting as much, right? It's very professional, baseline, borderline stuff now at this point. So yeah, I think we're in a really interesting moment in time for Twitter. I'm glad that Elon hasn't turned the platform into this crazy right-wing megaphone as much as he intended to. We've seen things flare up, of course, right? But yeah, the whole chapter of Twitter has broken my heart because so much work that I had worked on was undone effectively overnight, right? And then slowly things were being dismantled and people were being fired. Like, what lunatics fires your own payroll team so that you cannot pay people, right? Like, literally, like this is just anyway. We could have a whole event just about this, but anyway.
Ben and Mona, do you feel like your hearts were broken and all the work that you guys did were also undone?
At least for me, perhaps not yet. I am sad about where it ended. But I think it's important, I know we're gonna get to a session of looking forward, but like as I said, I think a lot of what we did was in the era of traffic, right? And we're entering this era of AI. And I want to make sure that we learn the lessons, the correct lessons from the past and not pretend and make things up that are relevant going forward. And so I think one of the important things about that is like what happened at Twitter, my observation, that wasn't regulation related. That was Elon Musk related. Right? So let's not overread that situation in that way. I would say Facebook and Google, much more regulation related, and you can have the arguments whether they cared before the regulation or not. But again, so I think you need to make sure that we're kind of precise in this as we go forward into this new era and take those lessons. But it makes me sad because, and I think somebody on the chat disagrees with me, which is all wonderful, and hopefully we'll get to the questions. But my observation, having lived it, is that regulation made at least Google view news as a problem. It was difficult. It wasn't an opportunity, right? How do you mitigate risk rather than build products? How do you deal with the operational impact of being forced to do deals in Australia, right? Rather than what does the Australian news ecosystem need, right? And so it changed the approach that was taken. And so therefore, I'm not anti-regulation at all. All right, but you need to figure out for regulation, what is the problem you're trying to solve? And I had a regulator say this to me in one of my Thomson talks, which is regulation is a very blunt tool. You need to figure out what is the problem you're trying to solve? Is regulation the answer? And if it is, who benefits? Because it may not be the people that you actually want to benefit, right? So, using regulation, you need to be very focused on it, is what I would say. And I think it's going to be really important in the AI age that the regulation is done right.
So a little bit of given your knowledge, you work with many publishers, and is it even possible for the news industry to have an equitable relationship with tech companies, given these different dynamics that's sometimes beyond the control, especially I would say in the US context, is like there's a lot of smaller players that don't have the same power as Axel Springer or New York Times, right? Like we have an emerging nonprofit, right? Like the entire news ecosystem, business strategy is already on shaky grounds. So when we think about like, especially now, when we think about like the investment companies like Microsoft or OpenAI, is making, and then the controversy with perplexity, right? Like what when you say like what are the lessons? Do you think the news industry actually learned the lessons, or are
I,
we sort of still like in the same old
I
because we're
don't think
just so desperate for cash?
I don't think we've learned the lessons, and I don't want to dominate so on, but I'll say very quickly, I don't think we've learned the right lessons. What I see is uh, very large publishers who are out for themselves. And if you're Axel Springer or whoever, that's fine. Even the New York Times, I wish there was more that people would do more collectively. Because in terms of, is it an equitable relationship? I'm not sure it can be, right? We're talking about completely different sizes and completely different industries and different incentives, even with the three companies that we're talking about. But I think what we need is a more transparent way of looking at this. And also, I would suggest saying, hey, this is about the information ecosystem overall, right? So, okay, maybe you will get slightly less New York Times, but if you go into it sometimes collectively, actually, this is going to be better, right? And I think there are different approaches that one can take. And I've got a few ideas, but I will shut up and let my other esteemed colleagues talk.
Yeah, I'll jump in, and I think there have been some lessons learned, but publishers have a habit of repeating lessons, so there's that. But yeah, I think, either, to what Madhav was saying, we're seeing sort of lawsuits or partnerships, right? And in my opinion, I think regardless of the size of a news organization, and obviously bigger orgs have, tons of resources and lawyers and things like that, whereas some of the smaller newsrooms don't. So I think, yeah, some of the smaller ones, hopefully should be banding together and working together to have some solutions. But I think in general, no matter the size of the publisher, my best advice to publishers is hold these tech companies to account, really hold their feet to the fire, really put pressure on them. From things I've learned about other platforms, platforms would drop some money and then run off, and not necessarily like continue to support initiatives and things like that. And I think newsrooms didn't do enough to advocate for themselves in those scenarios, quite frankly. And I think that's a lesson learned, right? Like these publishers, like these agreements and accepting money and all kinds of things, there should be so much fine print that is fully spelled out, and like, everything should be ironclad, to where these tech companies are not continuing to run over publishers, quite frankly. And I hope that we
But is
see that
that
kind of emerging.
realistic? Because I just feel like if you are like a publisher and you're getting like a grant, sometimes you don't feel like you have that power to look at it. I mean, I don't think many publishers are in a position to say no. I mean, I think here's like is look at the conundrum here. It's like with the money, right? Like so, Ben, be here interesting in terms of like what is the lesson here? Is the lessons we should say no? Is the lesson a class action suit? Like I'm still very like because right now, like I don't think there's a consensus in terms of what to do with like, this generation of like in the context of AI, like what are we doing with these companies? Right? Like, are we getting smarter? I don't know. I don't get the sense that we are. And so what can like what like just being from your purview in terms of like thinking back in terms of like what should publishers do differently when they negotiate with you guys? Should we just be less grateful? Because I feel like we went in like we went in and say you guys we basically were very explicit about how our revenue was eroded because of these tech platform. Like I don't know how many version we could say. I don't think at that point we were throwing lawsuits like we are now. Right. So in terms of like if you were a publisher now, like what will your advice for them to
Yeah.
be?
I don't think we say no. I think it's yes and being very, very clear and explicit about like the rules of engagement.
Yeah, I'm just still struck by the discrepancy in skill sets, broadly speaking. Again, funny, the more we discuss this, the more pessimistic I get, which I hate to say out loud. But like in my experience in newsrooms, like the fundamental objective is to cover what's happening day to day, right? And like, I don't know what percentage of the organization is committed to that work, but I'm going to say the bulk of it, right? In a tech company, like there's a zillion priorities, and that's not even close to one of them, right? And one of the skill sets is like this agility and this sort of nimbleness and this sort of portfolio approach to investment and growth. And in the other, it's like you're kind of back to fight or flight, in fight or flight, dealing with what's breaking and trying to get ahead of what you're planning. So it never feels like this is a central skill set of any of these organizations, at least none of the ones that I worked in or worked with, right? You know, I mean, I think we can find exceptions, but they're exceptions. So there's this like fundamental, I mean, guys, correct me if I'm wrong, and Nikita, you're on the front lines of helping to arm individuals and organizations, and so is MTC with some of these skills. But in terms of prioritization within an organization, the ratio is out of whack between the two. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I would say there's a cultural issue going on, right?
Culture.
And I think technology companies are culturally different from news organizations. And I'll give you one very quick example. Like tech companies think about MVP, minimum viable product, right? What's the smallest thing that you have to do? If you're writing a news story, you're not
Right.
thinking about the smallest thing, right? What's the minimum viable edit? No, right? So there's actually a cultural disconnect. I think where this overlaps is what I call on the product side, right? Because actually, I think news organizations have to transform. And so I think a lot of the work that was done by the Facebook Journalism Project, and some of the accelerators and other things was about creating the culture and the skill set of product within news organizations. And so, if I'm trying to be glass half full about some of the stuff that was done, I think there was a culture change that was done, some of it through the money that was there, but also through the skill set and the learnings, and there's accelerators and other things like that. But I think, again, for me, in the age of AI, you need to really think about for me, what is the ecosystem solution here? Because if everybody takes the individual, and this is why I joined Human Native, like I was worried that big tech was doing a few deals with big media and everybody else gets frozen out, right? And so we're trying to build an open marketplace, not an open, a managed marketplace for AI data so both sides can work. Sorry, I'll stop pitching. But the point about this and the point about regulation, because I see some stuff in the chat about regulation, is what's the problem that you're trying to solve, right? And my theory is the biggest problem in the news industry since digital hit is that it basically undermined the business model of news, right? So actually, it's the business model is the money. Business model is the problem. That's why everyone was asking for cash, and you need to actually solve that element of the business model if you're going to move forward. And I think you also need to be honest about it, which is like, yeah, did Facebook take a lot of the advertising money out of the industry? Potentially, but guess what? They built a better product, right? No one has a God-given right to anybody's attention or money or advertising, right? And it was much easier before digital when news organizations had gatekeeper access to information, advertisers, and audiences. But that doesn't exist anymore. So we've got to evolve, and we've got to evolve in a way that's good for everybody, I would say.
Do you think the industry as a whole is too silo, so therefore we don't really negotiate with the tech? Because I feel like each one of your program is sort of dictated by your internal mechanism, right? It wasn't that like the entire, like, I don't know, because at least I haven't read any. It's not like, Gannett, McClatchy, Tribune, NBC, CBS all come together as a group and like have a meeting, say this is what we want aside from, cash, right? Like, maybe not the cash, because I feel like there's a lot of public finger pointing about technology taking, business away from the news, but like, do you think this could be an effective strategy, especially right now, right? Like, because again, we see like this New York Times, like, we see individual organization doing individual deals. Is that effective? Is that one of the lessons that we fail to learn, that we actually shouldn't do it?
I definitely, my view, my advice to a news organization is number one, in the age of AI, number one, block the crawlers. Number two, figure out your strategy. And number three, collaborate, right? And I guess if I had to have a number four, but I prefer a rule of three, don't don't be gaslit into thinking that it's this way, right? That, oh, just because somebody did a deal with OpenAI, there's either no more deals to be done or that's the only way to do it, right? And you need to kind of like hope that they return your emails, right? I think this is a new world. We need to build the ecosystem that we want, having learned the right lessons from the past. And in the past, if you just kind of did stuff for yourself, it didn't build that. And to some points in the chat, let's get the incentives right as well, right? Because if we don't get the incentives right, then I think and the way that we measure those incentives, then I think we get outcomes that none of us want.
Yeah, and to add to Madhav's list, which is excellent, I would add one more thing. It's ethics, right? Like, what is your policy? What's your internal policy, external policy? Like, you just have to always think about AI, all technology, really. Every decision about anything for any kind of news organization, you have to remember your ethics, right? And that should be your North Star, in my opinion.
Ben, anything to add?
+1. I mean, my whole thing is like, can you take a portfolio approach and prioritize where your investments are? Can you work together? I mean, I'm sorry, but Paul, you worked with me on this. The whole thing I was hoping to do was to get organizations in the ecosystem to come together and collaborate and prototype in real time to do product development and solve some of these problems together. And, we got stopped in our tracks, and it was a little Pollyannish, but it does seem to me like, how do you come together and actually do things together? Not just share ideas, right? But actually prototype and build things. And again, how do you find the resources time-wise to do that when you're fundamentally in the business of coverage, and survival?
I would also add one other thing that I'm observing in the kind of AI era that troubles me. So this is not, I'm not, this is that, in my new job, I'm talking to huge AI companies as well as the smaller ones. The issue is that they're thinking about content, right? Purely from a quantitative perspective, right? And if you hear all the things, it's about the billions of tokens and the this and that. And they're not talking about qualitative, right? And quality, sort of a build from Nikita's point about ethics. And that worries me, right? That we don't actually, yeah, they can quantify the numbers through tokens, but there's no metric for quality, right? And therefore, I worry that that ends up again, incentive structures get incorrect, and then where does that play out? If you have an answer, please email me. I'm easily findable on LinkedIn.
Yeah. So just want to do a time check. We have 10 minutes remaining. And so actually, I just saw a question from Ian Kelly. How do you turn a zero-sum fight for readers and users to a shared and collaborative goal of quality and informed public?
So I think this is about, at least for me, what level are you solving for this problem, right? If you're solving for this at a country level, then I think what you're trying to do there is you have to identify what are the needs of the country, right? And actually, when I've looked at like the different, value transfer things, I get to a point where like in the traffic age, not the AI age, in the traffic age, the least worst way to do it, I found, if you're not going to do like a tax that will go back to, to do journalists, to help journalism and journalists, then I think you need to do some kind of country fund to do that, right? And figure out the ways to do it. And I think it's going to be really interesting to see what happens in Canada and in Taiwan. No one talks about Taiwan, but Taiwan there first, right? I think in the Gen AI age, I think you're going to need regulation almost in the way that they did back in the days of photocopiers, where actually there's a tax on that goes into some central pool that can fund everybody, right? Or you're going to get solutions like Human Native, where you build a marketplace that actually allows the matching of this. But I worry that you don't want to create a system that only the big guys are able to afford or do stuff, right? You need it for the ecosystem. Sorry, I talk too much, but
No, so maybe someone else could take on this other question from Dio, where The question was, how might news org go even further upstream than American consumer tech companies and engage with telecoms and other infrastructure provider of the internet? Right. And so it's interesting, like, because when you think about Verizon's acquisition of Yahoo, but now it's like not really quite like an AT&T, like they are like infrastructure company buying like, Comcast, NBC, right? Like, is that like a different way of thinking about like, for the publishing industry to be like better?
I think that's such an interesting question. I don't necessarily have a clear, concise answer for that because I'm stuck on governments. And when you think of US government and then all of the other governments, and like it just then sort of I think we get into that regulation territory. I don't know. You've given me so much food for thought with this question.
Mm-hmm.
And so as we sort of go, in our final sort of 7 minute, like again, going back to the context of this is, you know, in the era of Gen AI, what we see is we're going to still have, Facebook Meta and Google being a strong player, right? Like as long as like Elon is running Twitter, I don't see like they're going to go back into news, but we're going to see a new crop of big companies, right? Like Anthropic, right? Like, Cohere, Perplexity, OpenAI, like how should publishers orient themselves, right? Because I do think, Manav, like you say, is like I've just seen too many individual deals, like like there's like you know some investment to HAP, right? And then there's some have like a contract deal. Do you think this is too short-sighted for the publishers to think about like grabbing the money now and not thinking about the long-term consequences and eschewing an effective strategy? Or is that also a short-term sort of like short-sighted, right? Like if you were the publisher, like what will you do in like at this moment? Like what are the, not so much what you do, but like what are the questions that you should ask yourself right now to protect yourself, for at least like a decade? Like what are some of the fundamental you think that every publisher should ask before like the gut instinct? Because I do think there's a lot of tension between the business side and the editorial side, right? To sue, not to sue, to block, not to block, to get the money now, right? Like what is the questions that we should be asking as an industry?
I would
I
say,
talking
oh,
too much. Please go, Nikita.
sure, sorry, Madhav. I would just say, stop working on these kinds of things in silos, right? There are times when we have seen this industry pull together in just incredible ways. Look at Panama Papers, just as one example, right? Editorial, comms, legal alignment in hundreds of newsrooms, right? Look at something like ACOS, right? The Safety Alliance. There are so many news organizations that are working together on ways to protect journalists, right? Creating resources and things like that. I could go on and on about some of these amazing collaborative efforts in different areas of our industry. And so with something like AI for this moment in time, I think, and I've seen this from Twitter's perspective, right? A good example is with AMP, sorry to my friend over here, but with that, one newsroom deciding they were going to try and block their AMP pages on Twitter, and then others like, how did they do that? How did they? And then suddenly they were talking, right? These news organizations, their tech teams were actually chatting and coming up with solutions. And I think we need to see more of that. And I don't know if it's Hacks Hackers or if it's ONA. I don't know who the convening group is to bring folks together to really just share knowledge and information, right? Because that's the only way effectively, if there's unity in knowledge, then we can present a united front in working with these organizations. And again, I know that sounds very rosy and optimistic, but that's just who I am.
I think it's the only way. Otherwise, we stay in the like sort of survival mode of taking the handouts. And, in my tenure at MTV News, in order to keep that institution alive, and ultimately, as you all know, it didn't work. I was doing integrated marketing deals just to keep the lights on, right? And that was bleeding from building, to some degree, from building a better strategy long term. And I think the same risk exists here. I appreciate the enormity of of the undertaking that Nikita describes. And second, the point of view that, you're well equipped, Paul and co, and folks on the call who are involved in O&A and so forth domestically, well equipped to try and I know you have, start some of those conversations, build some of those prototypes, do some of that thinking, right? But it seems like the more of one's own IP one can develop, the more one can invest in one's own organizational capabilities. Like that's where I think sustainability and longevity comes in, right?
Yeah, I think that I completely agree with the collaboration thing. The other thing I would say is don't just do it for the short run, right? The short term. And I know it's really, really hard and you got you got to hit the quarterly targets and all of that. But you have to think about this. I mean, we've heard about publishers who have signed away rights in perpetuity. I mean, we would not recommend doing that in any way, shape, or form, right? And what is the sustainable way that's not just for you, right? You know, and I think the other thing I would say is do not be gaslit into believing that it's all been decided and it's all done, right? The rules of engagement, the rules of the road are being developed now, right? So I know we were talking about this before everybody jumped on that like my assessment is that a lot of publishers are doing the kind of stress response. It's like fight, flight, or freeze, right? Fight is you're suing, flight is you're hoping that OpenAI return your calls and give you some money. Most of them, I think, are in the freeze mode, right? But I think you need to lean in and figure out how do you want to build this in the way that's right for the ecosystem and for you, rather than take what some of the publishers have done, which is what's right for us in the short term.
Oh, Ben, you are muted.
Good. To extend the metaphor, you need to process, I beg your pardon, but you need to process the trauma, which is part of what you're doing here, which is what happened? How can I get safe again? And that's a challenge given the line of work, speaking in metaphor, and given the context. But that's where you got to get. And again, Paul, you're kind of well equipped in company to do some of that stuff, to do some of that work, that convening and that building in the collective.
Yeah, and I have one more analogy, given the current state of my private life, but is there a co-parenting situation out there? Because that is literally my life right now with my child and my ex-husband. And maybe that's something to think about, right?
Yeah,
Wow.
I think intermediaries and neutral parties can actually help in this. And sorry, Paul.
I would say the last 2 minutes is the bomb because it's really about it just I love the idea framework is fight, flight, or freeze. Which one of us is, where are we in this? And Ben, I just think it's really insightful that you brought up is maybe many publishers have not even had the time to process the trauma that we dealt with from how the tech company eroded our entire business, right? So what does that healing process look like that doesn't cost the fight, flight, and freeze? And Nikita, I'm just sort of like, who is another industry that we should co-parent this with? Really is a key question. Is maybe it's time for us to get out of even within the publishing silo, right? Like the news ecosystem silo. Is there a different industry that could be a potential co-parent with us to go negotiate? So I think this is um amazing. So I would say thank you for your insight. And now I will toss it to my co-partner, Bert, who will promote the next Real Talk conversation. So Bert.
I should say one thing because I'm seeing some
Yeah.
things on chat about the questions. So maybe we could take some of the questions to LinkedIn or somewhere else if we haven't addressed them or they were that. Or even someone's hey, someone wants a part two. I'll leave that with you guys.
Okay. Bert, do you want to let folks know in terms of the next sessions?
Yeah, hey everybody. So can you hear me? Yes. I just posted a link in the chat. We're doing another one of these 2 weeks from now, and the title is RIP Web, AI is in your interface. So we're going to have people talking about, given the new apps, chatbots, voice assistants, all this, like what happens to interfaces for news and information? How will news companies adapt? What are some ideas about new types of things you could do? And we have people from the Washington Post and also Particle, which has a bunch of ex-Twitter people actually who are building a new news app that's currently in beta. So hope you can join us then.
And again, Ben, Manav, Nikita, thank you for sharing your insight. And yeah, if folks let us know if we want to do a part 2, we could design a part 2.
Thank you so much. Sorry for talking too much.
Okay, bye.
Thank you.
Great to
Bye.
see you.